glad to be in front of what I think are the most special people in the world, those of you that work out there in the schools for Tree of Knowledge, whether it's a school or a clinic. We cannot express enough our appreciation for all the amazing work that you do. Years ago, I had Rick Lavoie as one of our early professional developments, and he told over a story that has always stuck with me, and so I just wanted to bring it out again today. He tells over a story that there was a father and a son. Father finally retired, and now that I live in Miami, I actually appreciate this story even a little bit more. It was a beautiful day in Miami in the winter, and they go out for lunch, and the father has never had time to go out with his son, but now that he's retired, he goes, and they're sitting, and they're overlooking the ocean. If you guys could just visualize with me for a second. And they're having this amazing conversation, and the father just drops and faints. And they call 911, and the EMS people come out, and they're working on the father for 30 minutes, and they can't get a heartbeat. And the EMS guys go to the son, and they say, listen, we're going to take him to the hospital, but we just want to let you know that we just can't get a heartbeat. And the son, who's 30 years old, punches the EMS workers. And the EMS workers hug the son because they know that it has nothing to do with the work that they just did. They know that this man is in terrible pain. Those of you that are out there working with some of the children with challenges understand that we are first-line people. And sometimes we get punched. Sometimes it's by a student, and it's not necessarily physically, right? And sometimes it's by a teacher or a frustrated principal or a frustrated parent. But I want you guys to remember that it's really not the work that we do. The work that we do is amazing. Every day that you get up and you go into that classroom, or you go into that office, or you go into that school, or you make that phone call to the parent, you are the EMS workers. You are out there saving children. And no matter what the reaction is, we know that the work that we do is so very important. So I just wanted to start with that, expressing gratitude and thank you for all the work that you do. Second thing I just want to bring up real quickly, I recently went to a class in Miami by a guy by the name of Gedalia Fenster, and he told me this, and it actually comes from AA, and I thought, hey, this is something we can all do and think about. So, when we get up in the morning, we get faced sometimes with controversy, we got to remember halt. Are we hungry? Are we angry? Are we lonely? Are we tired? 9 minutes of silence can prevent 3 hours of fighting. That's what only comes from AA. I think we can all use it. I feel like I'm 90% of the time hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. So best sometimes is to be quiet. But we have an amazing esteemed panel who are going to help us with other tools besides that. And hopefully they're going to help us do a better job than we already do. So I just want to introduce Tova. She's originally from Pittsburgh. She primarily works with trauma, with kids and teens, and parenting. She's a social worker, and she works for NALA, which is a referral-based mental health place. Dr. Shapiro, who is the author of this book, Child and Adolescent Therapy, and he's a clinical psychologist. He works for the psychology department at Case Western Reserve. His recent book, Child and Adolescent Therapy, Science and Art, is a graduate school textbook, and we are very honored to have two very esteemed mental health professionals that work in Cleveland joining us in this panel. Let me just go through a little bit of how we're going to deal with this today. So I have prepared questions that have come in from the staff that I'm going to ask and go through with them. Sometimes, I just want to pre-warn you guys, I may sound a little rude, but I actually learned that from Dr. Allerhan. I may have to cut it short just because we have an audience, we have a limited amount of time. We want to get through the questions, okay? So I apologize in advance. We would also like to open to the live audience for questions as well. So we're going to try to run through it. Obviously, every topic we discuss is a workshop in and of itself, is hours and hours of discussion, but we have to keep it to a certain period of time. Everybody has to get back to work to go work with the students, so we're going to try to tackle very difficult questions in a very short period of time. Okay, you all with me? Okay, good. So, we're going to start with the first question and kind of go into that, all right? So the first question that came is how to help a 12-year-old who doesn't want to be helped with emotional regulation. He thinks he will be fine, but when a situation occurs that is hard, he makes assumptions and then has behaviors. He's very high functioning, can tell you after his initial response what the right thing to do would be, and he even will eventually apologize. Okay, so we're going to start with Dr. Shapiro. Go for it.
Well, given the short time, I mean, I may do some referencing of things, but then you can sort of start, like, how many people know what something called motivational interviewing is? Some and not many. I mean, if you happen to know, it's relevant to situations like this. So, I guess in a summarized way of describing that type of intervention would be I would call it starting non-directively and then trying to get directive as soon as you can. I mean, people seem to be most open to influence when you start off by meeting them where they are and then try to pull them to where you are. My metaphor for that visually is like clicking and dragging on a computing screen. So to establish rapport in 3 sentences, I would probably try to say something like, you don't think that you need any help, you feel like you're fine the way you are, you don't know why these adults keep bothering you and trying to help you, and try to get a little bit of echoing, because until somebody believes that you understand where they're coming from, they're really uninterested in your suggestions. So, and then I would try to ask questions that sort of like along the lines of, how's it working for you? I think that's Dr. Phil. You know, how do you feel about the way things are going? You know, you throw things and you yell. And at some point, try to get the kid to the point where he'll sigh and say, you know, I couldn't actually be happier here. And that's the point of the conversation in which you can say, hey, you know, because I've got some ideas that I think might help you with that. Maybe what I just said could be done in 5 minutes. And maybe it will be done in 7 5-minute attempts, but that would be my answer to the question.
Okay. Tova, what would you think?
So actually, I'm a big believer in motivational interviewing. So I would definitely use the same technique. I find that it's really what I always call it in therapy is like the shift. So it's where you see them going from like, this is absolutely not for me, to them making their own decision and really taking ownership of that and saying, like, yeah, I actually do want to do something different. Like, this isn't working for me, as opposed to you saying, this isn't working for you. It becomes really their own thing, and they're taking ownership. Because as you said at the end of the question, whoever asked it, the important piece is that he does realize that it's an issue. So there's something to work with. It's not like completely, this is not my behavior, this is not my fault. He realizes it is his fault, and he realizes he did something wrong. So that's kind of where you can like hone in on that one piece and make that the biggest change.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to tackle a little bit of a controversial thing. We had posted some of the stuff on Facebook prior to this meeting, and we actually got some interesting questions from Facebook asking us how we were going to address some of this children with dysregulation. And one of the, there were 2 comments that stood out to me. One actually was, why do we not have a teenager with emotional dysregulation as a part of the panel? So I just want anybody to know that that's actually an interesting thing. I've actually done panels like that before. We couldn't do that today because it's during the day and during school, but it's not a bad idea, and I actually would like what your thoughts are on that, number 1. Number 2, they challenged ABA, Applied Behavior Analysis, and basically said, you know, should we be using behavior modification, positive and negative rewards with these type of students? And so I'm going to let both panelists address the behavioral way of working with these type of students and what they think.
Your turn to go first.
So for the first piece, I think that's a phenomenal idea to have someone on the panel of who you're actually working with and who we're talking about. I think that Rick Lavoie, actually, it's interesting you mentioned him. I just love his work. I see him as so wise because he takes the mentality of where these kids are coming from, and he puts you physically in their seat, and you feel, I don't know if anyone's familiar with him. If you're not, look him up, Lavoie. He's phenomenal, Rick Lavoie, and you really feel like you're in his in the student's shoes while he's talking, and all the stories make me cry. I'm not even a crier, and they still make me cry. But the really important thing is that then you see where they're coming from. So if we would have someone on the panel here and you would ask them like, well, this kid did the craziest thing, for that kid it's not crazy. For that kid it makes perfect sense at the time. And I know there's all studies done of putting students putting the teacher in the students' chairs and having seen their reactions and all that stuff. I think that it's just genius, because then you really get to see when you're telling them to do something why they don't want to do it. Now you kind of have an idea if they're not able to really compute what you're saying into their language. What is their language? Get an understanding of that, because if you are asking them to do something while they feel little ants crawling up and down their legs because they have, that sensory overload, or that's impossible to deal with, right? So if you would try that, try putting ants in your, in your stockings. Try putting ants in your pants and see what happens. So that's my first piece that I would go with. And then the second question, do you want to go?
Yeah,
I've just talked for a long time. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
then we'll look at that.
I agree with, it's good to have kids on the panel.
Okay, good.
I had a lot of problems in adolescence, but I don't want to
Same,
go
that's
into
why I
that,
would
right?
want-
I don't
that's
want to go
why-
into that now.
Okay, so we heard you, and we will try to do that for next time.
Yeah.
Why don't we address the behavioral component of treatment, Dr. Shapiro?
Well, you mean whether ABA? I mean,
Yeah.
I guess the way that I feel about questions like that is that I think that our field is really evolving from kind of partisanship and arguing back and forth about whether Freud was better than Skinner or Skinner was better than Freud. I think we're really kind of getting through with that, because I think that the reality is that human behavior has many dimensions, many aspects. The doctors don't have the orthopedists don't have arguments with the nephrologists about whether the skeleton is more important than the kidneys. Like what would that even, or what? There are different systems in our brains, and the different theoretical orientations kind of grab a hold of them. So I'm done arguing with that. I mean, ABA is based on really fundamental principles of not only human behavior but animal behavior, so there's nothing to argue about. Now, are those the only things that are going on? I don't think so. I don't think that principles of reinforcement describe everything, because the big piece that's not well described by that is this kind of emotion regulation piece and an emotion dysregulation piece. So I think that needs to be included too. One person who's done a lot of work at trying to put those two, and they often have opposite implications. That's what makes it fun. Not only are they different in what they would suggest that you would do, they're often the exact opposite. And a real simple example is if a kid acts out, should you go and talk to them and give them a hug? From an ABA perspective, I might be getting this wrong. I'm not an ABA
Don't worry,
person.
I'll let you go.
But from a Skinnerian perspective, from a behavioral positive reinforcement connection, if a kid is acting out and you go and you talk to them and you give them a hug, well, that seems like a big mistake, because you're just getting a lot of positive attention. From an emotion regulation perspective, it might be a great thing to do. They need to feel somebody rubbing their back a little bit and speaking in a soothing way to them. That might lower the activity in their amygdala and help them get their behavior control. So we've got two extremely coherent, well-developed theoretical bases for doing the exact opposite things. So I think that that's actually, I said to Shira before, I think that that's the single most important nitty-gritty on-the-ground question in working with the kind of kids that you work with, is at every given moment, is this behavior fundamentally driven by a voluntary seeking of rewards and incentives? Because if it is, I need to be doing ABA. Or is this behavior fundamentally the result of emotion dysregulation that's just spilling out into the world? Because again, opposite implications of the two things. That's an assessment issue. I mean, I could talk, if you give me another question about some ideas about how do you tell? How do you tell? But so that would be a follow-up question or something like that.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so now we're going to get into the more practical, real live. Here's a question that somebody sent in. So a student makes a rude gesture, maybe showing a finger at the teacher, maybe using a swear word, more out of an attempt to be provocative than in the heat of anger. What would be the recommended response, or do we do? The ABA response would be ignore. So, what would you think? Yeah.
So So when I saw that question, the first thing that came to my mind was, we're asking this question too late. We really are. There's something in the classroom that's making this child assume that they're allowed to do that, or that that's appropriate. And I think that a lot of it comes from the beginning of, I know everyone works differently, if either the beginning of the year or the beginning of, that everyone be on the same page, that everyone's realizing together that that is absolutely inappropriate, inexcusable if you decide that, or we ignore it as a whole. So I think that if that behavior is happening regularly enough in the school system, in your school system, that you have a unified front deciding what you're going to do with it. And it seems to me that when the kid is doing it in the moment, you already have, this is how we handle when a kid does that. Because in behavioral, like for behavioral kids, they're going to do that. They're going to curse. They're going to show you the finger. They're going to, do something inappropriate, maybe something provocative like that. And I would say just preparation for that is key. So yeah, that's kind of my.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro.
Yeah, so I obviously agree with that. The key words in that little teeny piece there was something about provocative in the heat of the moment or something. If people remember that word, it didn't sound like it was out of anger.
Right.
So I took those words as pieces of that assessment information that I'm so concerned about. I'm going to assume that this was not a kid who, if given a PET scan at that moment, we would have seen that the amygdala is lighting up like a Christmas tree, and if we had taken a blood sample, I'm assuming that we wouldn't have seen really high levels of cortisol and adrenaline, because at least the way the question is worded, this kid was not like freaking out and going crazy. In which case I would go in an ABA direction. Because if the behavior was not pushed by emotion, if it was more pulled by incentives, then I want to try to make the incentive structure not reinforce that unwanted behavior. My best bet about the incentive structure, attention. I know that's not very clever, but it sounds like a kid who might be getting maybe like, and then I'd be concerned about the peers. Is there a peer culture where this kid is going to be like the hero of the morning, even if he gets a detention or whatever? But is he still going to be the hero of the morning? So then I'd have to worry about that. But I might be inclined to punish a kid, because punishments do make sense if the behavior is driven by incentives. Punishments don't make sense if the behavior is driven by emotion dysregulation. Again, it's the opposite implication. You punish the kid, he was already dysregulated. Well, great, now he's more dysregulated, so that's going to be counterproductive.
Well, this is a good time to use some of that positive reinforcement. We have gift certificates that Shira got from a coffee house. And I'm going to open it up a little bit to the wide audience, and we're going to positively reinforce you with that gift certificate. So we'll start with you. I'm sorry, introduce yourself and what do you do? What do you do?
I'm a computer teacher at Derek HaTorah.
Okay, great. What's your question?
We keep mentioning ABA, the ABA approach. Just
yes.
For clarity's sake, what is the ABA approach?
Okay, very good question. Who wants to address ABA? I'm going to address ABA. I'm a BCBA candidate. I took my test. I don't know if I passed it, but I've done all the other work. And real quickly, it's the behavioral approach to dealing with behavior. So we look at what is causing the behavior in terms of, is it attention seeking? Is it a tangible, something that I want to get in that moment? So we look at what are the reasons, like you said, what are the reasons as part of the assessment? What are the reasons that this person is behaving this way? And then we tailor the intervention based on those reasons. So if it's attention seeking, or is it escape? Is it I want to get your attention, or I want to get out of doing this work? And so that's part of the assessment. And then the interventions, well, if it's part of escape, then I'm not going to let you escape. Okay, I'm going to try to do other things, so I make sure you're not getting rewarded by escape. If it's attention seeking, maybe I'm going to give you unconditional attention throughout the day so that you don't feel the need to have to constantly get my attention. It's based, as the doctor said, on Skinner. There's a tremendous amount of research on it. Unfortunately, a lot of the research that was done recently is based on children with autism, but it's really a mistake. It's really something that can be used. It's really something we all use. It's a part of the entire educational system and interwoven into the entire educational system. And it's the concept of what's behind the behavior, and then what are the interventions done to try to sort of fix that thing. It is what really makes it different is there's not a lot of talk therapy. So when he talked about Freudian and being different than Freudian, so we're not gonna sit and analyze and talk about your mother and all that kind of stuff. We're just gonna look at the behavior, figure out what's causing the behavior, and try to address that cause within the behavior, okay? Thank you. Any other questions from the audience before we continue? Nobody else wants coffee today? Okay, so we'll go on to the next question. Thank you. Okay, how do you deal with a student that